When the bomb threat evacuation alarm sounded at 9:42 a.m., most residents of Tower Heights panicked. But their doorman didn't run with the crowd. Instead, he moved with a precision that seemed impossible for a 60-year-old maintenance worker, his eyes scanning the building like he was reading blueprints that existed only in his memory. That's when they realized the man they'd ignored for over a decade might be the only thing standing between them and disaster. Welcome to the True Human Tales. Before we begin this gripping story of hidden expertise and unexpected heroism, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this should be shared with the world, hit that subscribe button. These are the voices that deserve to be heard. Tower Heights was one of those upscale apartment complexes that attracted young professionals who valued location over personality. 47 units spread across 12 floors, each filled with residents who nodded politely in elevators but rarely bothered to learn each other's names. It was the kind of building where people paid premium rent for the privilege of anonymity. Peter Kowalski had worked as their doorman and maintenance supervisor for 12 years, 2 months, and 8 days. Not that any resident was keeping track. To them, he was simply part of the building's infrastructure, as reliable and unremarkable as the elevator or the heating system. He arrived every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, parking his 15-year-old pickup truck in the staff space behind the building. He wore the same blue coveralls with Pete embroidered above the pocket, carried the same worn toolbox, and began each day by checking the lobby, testing security systems, and reviewing any maintenance requests left by tenants. The residents of Tower Heights found him perfectly forgettable. Polite enough, competent at his job, but utterly ordinary in the way that service workers were supposed to be. He fixed their garbage disposals without conversation, accepted their packages without comment, and maintained their building without ever intruding on their busy, important lives. What they didn't know, what 12 years of careful invisibility had successfully concealed, was that Peter Kowalski had spent 23 years as a police officer, with the final 8 of those years commanding the city's elite SWAT unit. The same quiet efficiency that made him an unremarkable doorman had once made him legendary among law enforcement professionals who dealt with the city's most dangerous situations. His morning security checks weren't about building management protocols. They were about threat assessment, vulnerability identification, and ensuring he understood every entrance, exit, and potential danger point in a structure that housed nearly 100 people. His worn toolbox contained more than standard maintenance equipment, and his pickup truck's cargo area would have surprised anyone who looked closely enough to notice the careful modifications. But Peter Kowalski had spent 12 years perfecting the art of being overlooked, because overlooked men could do their jobs without anyone questioning why a doorman needed to know so much about building security, emergency procedures, and crisis management. That strategy had worked flawlessly until the morning when being overlooked was no longer an option. Tuesday, March 15th, began like every other day at Tower Heights. The morning rush started at 6:30 a.m. with residents grabbing coffee and checking phones while waiting for elevators. By 8 a.m., the lobby was busy with people heading to work, dog walkers returning from morning walks, and delivery drivers bringing packages that Peter would sort and secure in the mailroom. 28-year-old Amanda Chen, a marketing executive in Unit 8C, barely glanced at Peter as she rushed through the lobby at 8:47 a.m. She was late for a client meeting and focused entirely on finding her car keys while juggling her purse, coffee, and laptop bag. "Morning, Pete," she called out automatically, not waiting for a response. "Good morning, Miss Chen," Peter replied, his voice carrying the same steady courtesy he showed every resident. "Have a good day." What Amanda didn't notice was how Peter positioned himself in the lobby to maintain sight lines to both the main entrance and the service corridors. She didn't see how his eyes tracked everyone entering and leaving the building, or how he mentally cataloged which residents were present and which were away. She definitely didn't notice the small radio clipped to his belt that connected him to emergency frequencies most building staff would never monitor. The morning continued with its usual rhythm until 9:39 a.m. when Peter's police scanner picked up chatter that made him pause in the middle of replacing a burnt-out light bulb in the mailroom. Possible explosive device, high-rise complex 4 blocks north of downtown. Bomb squad en route, evacuation protocols in effect, 4 blocks north of downtown. Peter knew the city grid well enough to realize that put the threat dangerously close to Tower Heights, close enough that if the device was significant, his building could be within the blast radius or evacuation zone. He quietly moved to the lobby's main desk and began pulling up building schematics on the computer, not because he needed to see them, but because he needed to look busy while he listened to increasingly urgent radio traffic. All units, we have confirmed explosive device at Metropolitan Plaza. Building evacuation in progress, establishing perimeter, unknown if additional devices present in surrounding structures. Metropolitan Plaza. That was the office complex directly across the street from Tower Heights. Peter's hands moved with practiced calm as he reached for the building's emergency communication system. 23 years of police experience had taught him that in crisis situations, seconds mattered more than permission or proper channels. At exactly 9:42 a.m., the bomb threat evacuation alarm echoed through Tower Heights for the first time in the building's history. The alarm triggered chaos that revealed how little the residents of Tower Heights actually knew about emergency procedures. People emerged from elevators confused and arguing. Some tried to call 911 on overwhelmed phone lines. Others stood in hallways debating whether this was a drill or something they should take seriously. But while 46 apartments worth of residents struggled with basic evacuation decisions, their doorman moved through the building like he was following a predetermined plan that existed nowhere except in his memory. Peter's radio crackled with updates that painted an increasingly serious picture. The device at Metropolitan Plaza was real, sophisticated, and large enough to cause significant damage beyond the immediate building. Police were establishing evacuation zones that included everything within a 3-block radius. Tower Heights was well within that radius. "Attention, residents!" Peter's voice came through the building's intercom system with an authority that made people stop arguing and listen. "This is not a drill. Please evacuate the building immediately using the stairwells. Do not use elevators. Exit through the main lobby and proceed east toward 5th Street. Move quickly, but do not run." His instructions were clear, specific, and delivered with the kind of calm competence that made people follow orders without questioning where those orders came from. Amanda Chen found herself in stairwell B with a dozen other residents, all moving with more purpose than she'd expected. Through the stairwell window, she could see police cars and emergency vehicles filling the street below, their flashing lights painting the morning in urgent reds and blues. "How does Pete know so much about this?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez from 9A, a retired teacher who'd lived in Tower Heights longer than anyone. "He's giving better instructions than the police." That's when Amanda realized something that made her pause on the 7th-floor landing. Their doorman wasn't just following building protocols or repeating information from emergency services. He was coordinating the evacuation with the kind of expertise that spoke of experience with situations far more serious than apartment maintenance. Through the stairwell window, she could see Peter in the lobby below, but he wasn't just directing residents toward exits. He was using hand signals to communicate with police officers who were treating him like someone whose input mattered. He was pointing to areas of the building and making gestures that looked suspiciously like tactical assessments, and when a group of confused residents started to head toward the parking garage instead of the designated evacuation route, Peter moved to redirect them with movements that were too controlled, too precise, too professional for someone whose job description involved fixing leaky faucets. "Jesus," whispered Tom Bradley from 6D, a retired military officer who recognized something familiar in Peter's bearing. "That's not Doorman training, that's command presence." By the time the last residents reached the lobby, Peter had transformed the chaotic evacuation into an orderly, efficient operation. But more importantly, he'd begun doing things that made it impossible to maintain the illusion that he was just a building maintenance worker. When the police incident commander arrived and began setting up coordination protocols, Peter approached him with information about building layout, occupancy patterns, and structural vulnerabilities that went far beyond what any doorman should know. When the bomb squad needed details about underground utilities and access points, Peter provided blueprints and specifications that he somehow knew from memory. And when emergency services needed to establish communication protocols for the evacuation zone, Peter offered technical knowledge about radio frequencies and coordination systems that made veteran officers ask uncomfortable questions about his background. "Sir," the incident commander said, looking at Peter with new attention, "what's your experience with emergency management?" Peter hesitated for a moment, glancing at the crowd of residents who were staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning recognition. For 12 years, he'd successfully hidden who he was. For 12 years, he'd been just another working-class man doing an unremarkable job. For 12 years, he'd convinced everyone around him that he was exactly what he appeared to be. But some situations don't allow for anonymity. "I used to work in crisis management," Peter said quietly. "Different kind of building, different kind of crisis. But the principles are the same. The bomb squad worked for 3 hours to safely dispose of the device at Metropolitan Plaza. And during those 3 hours, the residents of Tower Heights learned things about their doorman that redefined everything they thought they knew about the people who worked around them." Amanda Chen found herself standing next to Tom Bradley in the evacuation zone, both of them watching Peter coordinate with emergency personnel like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "You were military," Tom said to Peter during a brief moment when the older man walked past their position. It wasn't a question. "Police," Peter replied simply. "SWAT commander, 23 years, retired 8 years ago." "SWAT commander?" Amanda stared at him. "But you're our doorman." Peter nodded, his attention still focused on the emergency operations around them. "Being a doorman is a good job. Steady work, decent people, nobody shooting at you. I like fixing things instead of other things." "Other things?" Tom pressed. Peter's expression shifted slightly, and for a moment Amanda saw something in his eyes that made her understand why he'd chosen a quiet life maintaining an apartment building. Hostage situations, armed barricades, terrorist threats, drug raids, bank robberies, everything that required going into dangerous places to get innocent people out safely. He paused, watching the bomb squad vehicles in the distance. "I did that for 8 years, saved a lot of lives, lost some good people, made decisions that still keep me awake some nights." "So why didn't you tell anyone?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked. She'd joined their small group, along with several other residents who'd begun to piece together that their unremarkable doorman was anything but ordinary. "Because I came here to be someone else," Peter said. "Someone who solved problems with tools instead of tactics. Someone who helped people without having to worry about who might not go home to their families that night." The conversation was interrupted by the all-clear signal from the bomb squad. The device had been successfully removed, the threat was over, and residents could return to their building. But as they walked back toward Tower Heights, Amanda realized that something fundamental had changed. The man who unlocked the lobby doors for them was still their doorman, still wearing the same blue coveralls with Pete embroidered above the pocket. But he was no longer invisible. He was no longer someone they could overlook or take for granted. "Pete," Amanda said as they reached the main entrance, "thank you. For today, I mean. For knowing what to do." Peter looked at her, then at the small crowd of residents who were all looking at him differently than they had that morning. "I just helped coordinate an evacuation," he said. "Same thing any building manager would do." "No," Tom Bradley said firmly. "What you did today was command a crisis situation with skills that probably saved lives. That's not building management, that's leadership." Peter was quiet for a long moment, then held the door open for them with the same courteous gesture he'd made thousands of times before. "Well," he said finally, "I guess we all have our talents." Peter Kowalski continued working as the doorman at Tower Heights, but everything about how residents interacted with him changed after March 15th. He still arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, still wore the same blue coveralls, still fixed garbage disposals and collected packages with quiet efficiency. But now, residents stopped to talk to him about more than broken appliances. They asked his advice about neighborhood safety, sought his opinion on building security improvements, and occasionally shared concerns that went beyond apartment maintenance. Amanda Chen discovered that their doorman had been quietly implementing security enhancements for years, upgrading locks, improving lighting, and monitoring access patterns in ways that had kept Tower Heights safer than most buildings in the area. Tom Bradley learned that Peter's toolbox contained equipment that could handle everything from basic electrical work to emergency medical situations, and that his pickup truck was equipped with supplies that could support residents during power outages or other emergencies. Mrs. Rodriguez found out that Peter had been the one sending anonymous tips to police about suspicious activity in the neighborhood, using his law enforcement connections to keep their area under extra patrol attention. "He's been protecting us all along," Amanda told her friends 6 months later. "We just never knew it because he was doing it quietly, without wanting credit or recognition." Peter had spent 12 years hiding from his past, convinced that his police career was incompatible with the peaceful life he wanted to build. What he discovered was that service took many forms, and that protecting people didn't always require wearing a badge or carrying a weapon. Sometimes it meant being the reliable man who knew everyone's name, noticed when something seemed wrong, and had the skills to handle problems before they became crises. He'd traded tactical gear for coveralls, but he'd never stopped being a guardian. He'd just found a different way to serve and protect. The day of the bomb threat, the residents of Tower Heights learned that heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they spend years quietly taking care of the details that keep your world safe, asking for nothing more than the opportunity to do good work for decent people. And sometimes, when everything goes wrong, those quiet guardians turn out to be exactly the heroes you needed all along. At the True Human Tales, we believe that extraordinary people often choose ordinary jobs, not because they lack ambition, but because they've found peace in using their skills to help others without needing recognition. Have you ever discovered that someone you saw every day was actually remarkable in ways you never imagined? Share their story in the comments below. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel. We're here to remind you that heroes work among us every day, usually without anyone noticing until the moment their expertise becomes essential. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.